Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Rafson. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs here at the GSD. And on behalf of our team here in the Public Programs, which includes Raquel Rivera and Matt Smith in the AV booth, we're thrilled to welcome you to the 2024 Sylvester Baxter Lecture delivered by Laurie Olin. Before we begin the program, I want to point out the land acknowledgement you see on screen, because we invite you to take a moment to reflect where we are today, both historically and physically, where we are. How might foregrounding the stories and perspectives and worldviews of others shift our understanding of and obligations to the land and those around you? Those questions are probably more important than ever. We want to thank the Harvard University Native American program for their continuous work building relationships within and beyond the university to help us keep those questions at the forefront. I'd also like to note that we have live captioning available tonight for both those of you in the audience here and those joining virtually. If you're joining virtually, click the closed captioning icon that you see at the bottom of your live stream window. And for those of you in the theater, this QR code will help get you there. And if you have any questions activating this feature, our colleague Matt in the AV booth can help you out. I also want to welcome you back to this theater for a couple of exciting upcoming events we have organized. On Tuesday, November 12th, Sheila O'Donnell, the founding director of the Dublin-based O'Donnell and Tuomi Architects, will describe her process of designing buildings from the ground up and the inside out. And after that, on Friday, November 15th, please join us for the Loeb Fellowship Symposium entitled A Round Table, Makers and Users. This symposium brings 5 Loeb Fellows from the 10 years of John Peterson's curatorship of the program to share stories of how interdependence and collaboration have been instrumental to the success of their work, exemplifying and extending the Loeb Fellowship's vision and reach. So we hope you'll join us for those. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Gary Hilderbrand, chair of the Landscape Architecture program, here to introduce tonight's lecture. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Raquel and Matt for the good work they do in helping us host our public events. And good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to another 70-degree day in November. Summer's back, and you should be worried about that. It's been a difficult week, seeing palpable and very precise evidence of political division in our country, and seeing that our democratic experiment is definitively imperfect and decisively fragile. I feel privileged and grateful to be part of the welcoming and ever-optimistic community that we continuously build and steward in this school. Tonight's lecture by Laurie Olin is supported by an endowment that was established at GSD in honor of Sylvester Baxter. Baxter was a visionary advocate for landscape architecture and town planning, who, along with the landscape architect Charles Eliot, secured the passage of legislation establishing the groundbreaking Metropolitan Park System of Greater Boston and the Trustees of Reservations, public reservations as it was called then, in the 1890s. We continue to enjoy the results of their beneficent action, and here at the Design School we continue to interrogate the why and the how of the conservation ethic behind that great work 130 years later. It's a grand pleasure to introduce Laurie Olin tonight, and it's not an easy feat. And on behalf of the faculty, I want to thank you, Laurie, for devoting a couple of days to talking with some of our students in classes during your visit. That's extremely generous. We're fortunate this evening to be treated to a new talk by Laurie, a query about writing by a designer. Laurie will address the stages of influence and reflection that precede and may shape subsequent creative activity. He asks this question: why would a person whose creative drive has been directed to another medium choose to make a book? Well, we had a picture of his library there. I was going to say he's a man of books, but I feel that with great confidence that he has an answer to that question. It would be unwise for me to try and cast a comprehensive picture of Laurie Olin in the time that I have here. More useful to choose a few things. First, though, it's important to say that Laurie's many gifts and his assiduous and exquisite work in the field over 5 decades have earned him the reputation not just of being a great designer, which he is, but indeed a worldly raconteur and a sage and wise man. An erudite presence wherever you find him, a person full of humanity and passion for the work, a professional without detractors whom everyone seems to want to work with, and a designer whose many outstanding works have endured and inspired generations now of designers, but also people who aren't designers. A month ago in Washington, D.C., I attended a screening of a new feature film that is essentially a contemplative sermon on Laurie's way of inhabiting the world. The film, made by award-winning director Gina Angelone, is called Sitting Still. There's a striking archival material on the quite gripping narrative of Laurie's family moving across the country to Alaska during his early youth, and at age 6, starting to draw everything he saw in order to make sense of a world that seemed foreign to him. Age 6. What were you doing when you were 6? The film is really about seeing the world through drawing as a way of learning about the world. Of course, I knew this about Laurie, but I was honestly very moved by the director's cut that I saw. And I'm happy to say we are planning a screening here early in the spring semester, after it makes the rounds of the film festivals where it is now and before it hits theaters. My selfish hope for Sitting Still is that it reaches a whole set of audiences beyond designers. Film lovers, urbanists, artists, journalists, audiences who will learn more about how seeing the world from a landscape architect's point of view delivers infinitely greater information and knowledge about the world. Of the many reasons to be pleased to have Laurie here tonight, a big one for me is personal. 40 years ago, when I was a student here, I sat there, he stood here. Laurie was one of my studio and theory teachers, also true for Anita Veraspaitia, and he was also the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. What I learned from Laurie above all was that he modeled the possibility of leading a double life, to have meaningful professional practice and uphold a commitment to teaching at the same time. I should rewrite that, to have an extraordinary professional practice and be an amazing teacher for almost all of his life. I mentioned this last Thursday at the exhibition opening for Bas Smets. The tradition in this school, in each of the design disciplines, of practitioners teaching alongside scholars, teaching from practice, teaching from making work, is a cherished hallmark of the department and the school. As students back then, we were excited with the rising practice called Hannah Olin. Watching them begin in those years to acquire first significant corporate projects and then, even more importantly, public realm commissions, and seeing them collaborate with the best architects of the day, many of them in this building, Harry Cobb, Gerhard Kollmann, Michael McKinnell, later Peter Eisenman, eventually Frank Gehry, Todd Williams, Billy Chen, the list goes on. It was especially the public realm projects that were establishing Bob and Laurie as designers of a civic space with generosity, fluency, a rare but powerful literacy, a grammar, poetics that support life in the city and brings shared cultural meaning to ordinary things like streets, plazas, and parks. Now, I'm going to go back to something I published more than 20 years ago. Laurie Olin was one of a ragged group of students from the late 50s and early 60s at the University of Washington who were persuaded by the one and only Richard Haig to consider a different path. Although they were architecture students who took Rich's courses probably as a distraction, they all, after studying with him, turned toward the landscape. After some formative years in Rich's studios and office, Laurie and Bob formed the practice of Hannah Olin. There were others like Ilza Jones and Grant Jones, right? Frank James. Haig led these students and others to see the possibilities for having a more dramatic impact on and rescuing or protecting the land, as well as the potential for exploring the subjective, connotative aspects of design. While architecture during this period often was constrained by the repetitive demands of program and type and the norms of building in the late modernist idiom, landscape architecture as taught by Haig offered fresh circumstances. Haig taught that time itself works powerfully to change the landscape. He contended that the individual's primary role in the landscape is to understand nature's work and disposition, the biological regime, its cosmological order, which must be respected. If that meant conserving resources, preserving building fabric instead of redesigning, or taking risky political stands, like the Pike Place Market, that was what we had to do. So for a group of idealistic young people rebelling against architecture, Haig, with an almost religious zeal, delivered an epiphany. The landscape is the site for urgent and meaningful work, and that's what it is today also. Laurie Olin and Bob Hanna took it up with gusto, moved to the East Coast. Once you have Hanna Olin for many years, then Olin, now Olin Studio, which remains a powerhouse for practice, for research. They're doing incredible soils research in that firm, advocacy, and great works of design. And just to name a few, Bryant Park in New York. Anybody not love that? When I was a kid, you didn't dare go up the stairs and past the walls because you would have been abducted. They reversed it, right? Now you can't stay away from it. You want to stay in Midtown. The grounds of the Washington Monument. You know, I always thought that Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s work was pretty flat, except at the Lincoln Reflecting Pool, where it feels like a French garden. But what Laurie did at the Washington Monument was solve the security problem post 9/11 in a beautiful way where you don't even think about security. That's an amazing work. The Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Columbus Circle in Manhattan, these are just favorites now. National Gallery of Art's Sculpture Garden, always have to make a stop. Apple World Headquarters, which somebody decided to call Apple Park, and the list goes on. Okay, so there's never any edginess in those projects. I'm finishing up soon. They always seem just right. They're accommodating, inviting, generous, inspiring, but with unimpeachable material choices. They're always superbly detailed by hand. They're also very much worth close study. If you want to learn to design well in cities, you had to look closely at Olin's work. Laurie is currently Practice Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's taught for 40 years, and where our good friend Catherine Sievert Nordenson has convinced him to return to teach drawing. Good for them. He's going to talk to our first-year students about drawing tomorrow morning. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy in Rome, a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and a recipient of the 1998 Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Not many of us get those. In 2012, he was awarded the National Medal of Arts by President Obama, and he has a high honor from ASLA with the ASLA Medal, and I could just keep going. So tonight, after Laurie's talk, we'll hopefully have time for questions. I took too long to do this. I've asked our dear Professor Alistair McIntosh to join Laurie and me on the floor. Now, this is very special because it was Laurie who brought Alistair to the GSD towards the end of his chairmanship in the mid-'80s. These two gentlemen are kind of cut from the same cloth, though our students might say Alistair might be a little more skeptical and ironic. And I'll just get out of the way and let them talk. Thank you, and please welcome Laurie Olin.
Oh dear, I actually hope that in a few years when I pass, the New York Times calls him for the obituary. So I did ask a question, as he said, and the quote, first we read and then we write, is from Emerson, and it's an interesting quote, and so I will start by saying that I'm going to try to answer this question a bit more fully tonight than the question of why would a designer do books than I did in the introduction to a collection of my essays at the Library of Landscape Library of American Landscape History did a few years ago. So let's begin. Let me say that I love books. I grew up around books. My father met my mother when she was working as a librarian, and he was on library boards all his life and wherever they lived. So I care about books. As Gary said, when I was very young, we moved to Alaska, and the first week I was there, I was staying in a hotel, and there was also an Eskimo who had come to town for medical treatment, a guy named George Agapuk, who had illustrated a book that the Indian Services had published called Igloo Tales, and he was fabulous, and we sat together for a week, and he drew for me, and we talked and everything, and I just thought, holy smokes, this is great. And then very soon thereafter, we met a person who had written a book called On Arctic Ice, a guy named Fred McIntosh. And he was kind of cool, and that was a really nice book. And then my parents had this friend named Frank Dufresne who did a book called Alaska's Animal and Fishes, and he'd drawn and illustrated it all. Those are Dolly Varden, if you don't know, a really beautiful tasting fish. So one of the things was, here I was in Alaska as a 6-year-old, surrounded by people who were writing books and doing stuff, and I thought, normal people do books, right? Isn't that, it seemed normal. But because my parents had all these books that they'd carted across the country in our little car, among them were some books that were full of illustrations. And of course, illustrations for texts go back to, biblical texts from, let's say, just at the end of the Roman period on. So, but secular illustrations for narratives happens, of course, by the 19th century. And these are books that were in our library, of course, Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, John Tenniel. I love those illustrations. And there was Winnie the Pooh, E.H. Shepard's great drawings for Winnie the Pooh, brilliant. But they had a big folio book of Fantasia. And the interesting thing about Fantasia is this was the period when narrative moved to images in film. And it's very interesting. It's the idea of narrative being in the image. Well, as a young boy, I was very hardy, joined the Boy Scouts and all this stuff, and I read all these books about animals, and, Ernest Thompson Seton, one of the founders of the Boy Scouts, had written a bunch of books about, the biography of a grizzly bear and all this stuff. I loved these books, but they were very well illustrated. There was books by Will James, Smokey, the cowboy who drew horses. And then there was the Scribner children's stories, which were beautifully illustrated by N.C. Wyeth. I read most of them, but I really looked at the drawings. They were fabulous. And I found that there was this book that I was given when I was in 3rd grade called Tree in the Trail by Holling C. Holling. I don't know if everybody's ever heard of him. He also did Men on the Mississippi. He did Paddle to the Sea. But this was a great book because it was an ecological history of the Southwest told through the life cycle of a cottonwood tree at a watering hole. And it was an ecological, cultural history, beautifully illustrated. So here I am reading ecological history as a 3rd grader. This is pretty good stuff I was being fed. And then by the time I started buying books on my own around 5th grade, I discovered this book that had originally been published in 1930, but I think I had a sort of 1950s version of it. It was called Good Medicine, and it was facsimile reproductions of letters by Charlie Russell, but also some letters between him and Will James, the cowboy artist. And so I found these very interesting because these were narrative, they were personal, they were drawings and writing all put together, bound together. And it all they supported each other in a way I found really fascinating as a child. And I loved it. Now, here I was in a place where, yes, we were in the woods. We're in a town that is smaller than you can imagine, like 13,000 people. But there were no museums. There were no art museums. There were no concert halls. There was none of that stuff. There was no television. It hadn't been, it hadn't arrived yet. But we had an art teacher named Rose Lawson, and around the top of her art room that we went to once a week, there were these pictures she'd put up, and here's some of them. These are actually ones that were there. I remember them. It was the Western iconic stuff. It was Rembrandt, it was Vermeer, it was Rosa Bonheur's Horse Fair, it was Cézanne, it was Gauguin, it was all that. Those are things now she didn't lecture us, she didn't tell us what to think about them. They were just there. We were meant to look at them, admire them, understand them, spend some time. They were just soak in. in. That was interesting. That was 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. She taught all the way up through high school, every grade in that school, because it wasn't a huge community. But then something happened when I was in 5th grade. My mother subscribed to something from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because we were living in a place called 26 Mile, which is 26 miles from Fairbanks. It's not much of a place there. And one of the things is, and there was these little booklets that would come, and they would have these sheets of, they had these sheets of reproductions that you'd cut out like stamps and paste in. And these were some of the things that were in those. And my favorite that I kept through college, and I don't know whatever happened to it, was a tiny little one it has Homer, Sargent, Akins. They're watercolors. I scrutinized these very carefully, as you can imagine. Well, as Gary said, I did start drawing. Actually, I started drawing when I was 3 or 4 before I even got to Alaska. But this is a picture of me when I'm, I guess, like in just junior high. My sister is next to me. That's the Yukon River. We're in Whitehorse, and I'm drawing. I started drawing everything because it just seemed so interesting to draw. And it was an interesting place. But then what happened is, of course, I had another source of information, of visual communication that was very powerful, that I've been looking at since I was, like in about 1st grade during the war. Terry and the Pirates during the war, very exciting, airplanes crash, sexy women, all that sort of stuff, but beautifully drawn. But I really thought better drawings were Hal Foster's drawings. He was the first guy who did Tarzan, and then he sold it to somebody and did Prince Valiant. And these drawings were exquisite. These people really knew how to communicate, and there would be words, but the drawings carried the story. And then when I got to high school, something wonderful happened. Mad Magazine, that's the cover of the first issue. We were so excited because it was so irreverent. That's how we all began to learn Yiddish, actually, in Alaska, was from Mad Magazine. There were all these words like kvetch. We didn't know what it meant, but it's a kind of interesting word. So we were getting stuff, and then, of course, there was this other thing, Pogo. He was a dropout from the Disney studio, Walt Kelly was, and his humor comes before Doonesbury, and it was much more subtle, but it was absolutely as political, even more witty than Doonesbury ever is, and it was so good. But we also, there was some culture. My parents had this other stuff in their library that I liked to troll through, and some of it was really interesting. But again, the best books seemed to be the ones that had really great illustrations. They were interesting to read. 7 Pillars of Will, wonderful drawings in it. Conrad, a collection of Conrad with some modernist stuff. There was, what do we have? We got Lawrence Stern over here. Then there's the obsessive drawings of Harry Clarke for Edgar Allan Poe, really weird and sexy and wonderful. Or Aubrey Beardsley's drawings for Salome of Oscar Wilde. Or Rockwell Kent's drawings that were in the collected tales of Shakespeare at his plays. So I was, going through stuff, and there was good books, and there was, sometimes you'd read a lot, sometimes very sketchily, but always studying it. And so by the time I was in high school, I was interested in archaeology, and I ended up spending one summer, well, partly because one of their parents' friends was an archaeologist who was working on a great dig in the old Bering Sea culture. And so I was reading about archaeology, and then I got a summer internship to collect Pleistocene fossils in the goldfields. And so they were for the American Museum of Natural History. I was working with this paleontologist. But then, there were other things still. I was still interested in art. And then as an adolescent, there was sex was always kind of interesting. One of my teachers gave me this great book that's actually, it's Rilke's essay on Rodin, which is very famous, but it was, to me, it was really very interesting because it combined two things that seemed quite fascinating. Meanwhile, I started college and engineering, and that didn't quite fit. So then I transferred into architecture, as you have heard, at the University of Washington. And while I was an architecture student, I kept drawing, and I was working on the Bering Sea. That's where I did this watercolor of a Russian Orthodox church at Naknek. And then my parents got tired of shoveling snow in the cold, and they moved to Tombstone, Arizona. So that's the city hall in Tombstone. So these are, while I was in college, I was drawing, kept drawing. But as Gary said, there was this guy you see on the upper left sitting with his back to you. That's Rich Haig. He was a student. He was a teacher of ours, and he had us read Thoreau's Waldo. He introduced us to J.B. Jackson. He subscribed to landscapes. We started reading. Then he said, oh, there's this book you got to read by an ecologist from Pennsylvania, Lauren Isley, called, and so we started reading ecology. And then there was, well, there's this interesting guy at MIT, this landscape architect, you better read this. And so as a college student, the literature began to be a little bit more applied to stuff. But meanwhile, you know, Seattle and the West Coast looks to Asia across the Pacific, whereas you guys here and where I live in Philadelphia, we look across the Atlantic to Europe. But the influence of the East was very heavy in Seattle. And so, lo and behold, we're looking at photos, studying plans, reading poetry. This is the period of the Beat generation, of course, and all the jazz and poetry and coffee shops and stuff. But this is the stuff we were reading when I was reading, and these are all books of mine when we were in college. An interesting magazine appeared that came from Los Angeles, edited by John Antenza, called Arts and Architecture. These are covers that I put into a collage by Ray Eames, Charles Eames' wife and co-designer. And this is a double-page spread from it, which shows a project of Roberto Burle Marx and Oscar Niemeyer. Try to find the building. It's very interesting in that plan. It's there, but you have to hunt for it. But so we were, you know, as students, we were looking and exploring and mining the stuff that we had available, and it was pretty good. Another mentor that was extremely important to me in my last year of architecture school, because I had almost no electives, I decided I was going to take this course in poetry, and I studied with a guy named Theodore Retke, one of the most prominent poets in America at the time, a friend of Louise Bishop's, a rival of Robert Lowell. And so I studied poetry, and it was really interesting, this close reading of a text. It was just what we were doing with buildings. It was close reading of something. And I learned as much about form and craft and the relationship of the pieces to the medium from Ted Retke as I learned from my architecture teachers, because it turned out it's the same problems in all of the arts, the same urges of how to condense things and boil them down and get the most. But after a few years of working as a young architect in Seattle, I moved to New York and found everybody was reading different stuff I'd never heard of. And this was a different culture. These guys all went to Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Penn, and they were reading about, you know, these things, very interesting theory about early modernism. And then there was this guy called Bob Venturi who was kind of blowing up everything, and he was kind of interesting. And but meanwhile, they've rediscovered the Renaissance. So the guys I was working with in New York, it was like my head had to turn like 90 degrees and take in a whole new literature at this point. So I was reading this stuff, and then there's this funny guy in Philadelphia called Ed Bacon who was interested in cities. And graphically, these are interesting. But meanwhile, I continued to be interested in something else. I was reading about ecology. I was reading about animal behavior. I was finding interesting things that were mostly written by, I guess, geographers. And then it turned out there was this anthology about human ecology. And so this was pretty good stuff. And I thought it was very important. And at that same point, the world was blowing up. The Russians invaded, the Czechoslovakia. The cities all blew up. There were fires everywhere. And so one of the things that happened was architecture didn't seem all that relevant anymore. And people were dropping like flies either from drugs or just getting out of things. So I moved out to the end of Long Island, and I spent the next year and a half pretty much in and out of a cabin out at the far end of Amagansett before it was crowded like it is now. And I was out there just drawing and painting and reading and writing. And I read a lot, I drew a lot, I painted, and I wrote a bit, not so much. But that was good, and it really helped me. And then one of the things was I realized I was very interested in the landscape, but I didn't know anything about plants, even though I had been around them. And I realized that books really weren't that good. You could pick up a book and it doesn't, it's got all this nice drawings and a lot of Latin and stuff, but somehow I decided the way to learn about plants is go be with plants and draw them and stare, and then go key them out after you've spent some time with them. So I've spent from 1968 to now teaching myself about plants, which is really the very hard way to do it. I don't recommend it. But I moved back to the West Coast because I had dropped out of architecture completely by then. And there I was out on Bainbridge Island in another cabin. And one of the things I began to do there was draw, again, what was in front of me. Sort of like Thoreau, I'd gone to the woods. So I was doing this stuff, and very carefully. But then, like Thoreau, I also came back into the city. You can only do so much out there if you're a person like ourselves and the people in this room, I presume. And I'd fallen in love with cities by then, and I got a studio on Skid Road, and I was spending some time down on Skid Road, and I discovered there was this community, and then it turned out there was this problem. The city was going to tear down one of the greatest public markets in America. So I ended up becoming vice president of Friends of the Market, and we had a fight. We sued the city. We managed to, I did all the paperwork. We got it, Vic Steinbrück and I got it on the National Register of Historic Places. And it was saved after a while, and the mayor got thrown out of office, and various things happened. But in doing it, I realized that planning had gone all wrong in Seattle, and so I wrote an anti-planning tract, which is called Breath on the Mirror, and I self-published this little book. So this is my first self-published thing. And in it, basically, I tried to explain the nature of the community, and as an anthropologist on the faculty at Penn later told me, it was a good piece of ethnography. I didn't know what ethnography was, but I was doing this with the people. I was living with them in their rooms, in the bars, in the missions, and figuring out that this was a legitimate community that was not understood, and people were trying to erase it, and I discovered that there was no decent public space in the city at all. And that bothered me. And because of this public fight with the city council and public planning, I kind of wore myself out. So I just decided to go to England for the summer where some friends had rented a house. I just bailed out. I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. I'm out of here. That was very intense. And so I went to England, and the first day I was there, I walked out into this park, and I thought, oh my God, look at this. And I realized what I was looking at wasn't just some rich man's thing. It was a design. It was an incredible design. And I thought, aha. So I became interested, so I started doing what I do. I went around, bought some books, and started going to visit sites and went to different places. And sure enough, I decided at the end of it that the English didn't understand the English landscape at all. They didn't realize its ecological contribution. That says, Ian McHarg once said, the fish will be the last creature to discover water. And I realized that was a problem. They didn't know what they had here. So I thought I'd write a primer, a simple little primer about the English landscape. I had this simple idea. But I went back to, and I was going to these places, I was measuring the sites, I was walking on them, all around them, drawing them, documenting them, and trying to figure them out. And so I went back to Seattle, and I thought about it, and well, the long story is that I ended up finally doing a book. It took way too long. I had no idea how hard it is to write a real book, and to have it hold up and be a book that I actually thought I would like to read. Well, one of the reasons to do the book was I realized that nobody knew how to do a history of a landscape that really had the art, had the economics, had the politics, had the ecology, that all these different disciplines, there was all these different studies, and Hoskins had written a good book about the making of the English landscape, but it had nothing to do with the aesthetic tradition or the cultural tradition. So I thought, somebody has to put this stuff together. Well, it was hard to do because it turns out there was no precedent for people writing that kind of landscape history. It irritated me immensely. But so I decided to apply for some fellowships, and I got them. So one was to go to England to work on the book, and the other one was the Rome Prize, because I didn't know I was going to get the other one, so I'd applied like when you apply to multiple colleges. For the Rome Prize, I said I wanted to study cities, to look at the public spaces in the cities to see what made them tick, and how these cities that had been inhabited by so many generations still worked for the people who were living in them. They weren't just a bunch of fancy monuments, the 12 buildings that you see in architecture history. There's a whole city full of people, and they seemed to be working pretty well. I wanted to look at that. So I went off to the American Academy in Rome and spent summers in England, winters in Rome, and I decided that I'd ransack the library and find out everything I could about landscape architecture. So I plunged into the library at the American Academy in Rome. I went to the Max Planck's library up at the Hertziana. I went to the Vatican Library, and I started trolling through libraries because I wanted to find out about landscape architecture and modern landscape. And there was great stuff up till about the 18th century, and then it kind of begins to fall off. There was a lot of literature and folios, but there wasn't much after that. And so the first thing I said was, well, I've got to teach myself about this stuff. Because if I want to do landscape architecture, I have to become the person people already are making the mistake they think I am. I don't really know what I'm doing here. So Christopher Tunnard I discovered down in the stacks. And he had been a person who had been brought here in 1938 by Hudnut to teach, and he obviously had influenced some people. Everybody in the room who studied landscape architecture and modernism knows there were these three students, Ekbo, Rose, and Kiley, were students of his. But so I was reading Tunnard and thought, that's interesting, but kind of limited and not very good in some ways. And then I found this book of Ekbo's, and I thought, yeah, here's a practitioner, one of Tunnard's students, and he'd written this book about his projects, and he'd been doing experimental work for Alcoa and others and hands-on stuff, and okay. And then there was this other guy who was senior to Ekbo, a guy named Tommy Church, and Church had suddenly realized younger people are publishing books. He'd better publish something. But he'd been doing a lot of publishing in House and Garden and in Architectural Record and in, where else, in Sunset Magazine. So he'd done all these articles, so he kind of pulled all that stuff together and got out a book also. Church was very influential. Everybody in the world has seen this kidney-shaped pool. This is the Donnell Garden, and the working drawings were done by Larry Halprin. A lot of talented people worked for Church. Rich Haig, Pete Walker, Larry Halprin, all these people, a lot of other people came out of that office. So I began tracking them. Meanwhile, back in England in the summer, I'm going to Oxford, I'm going into to Foyles downtown in London, I'm going to various places, and I discovered an English landscape architect who had published 3 volumes of lectures, a guy named Geoffrey Jellicoe, and they were very interesting because here was intellect, here was art history, here was someone doing things and he was talking about meaning and expression. I thought, that's interesting. I'm not getting that out of Church, and I'm not getting that out of Ekbo. And so I began looking very carefully at Jellicoe's work. But back in Rome, meanwhile, I was meeting other people like Spiro Kostov, having breakfast with him, and it turned out, well, he had just done an exhibition at Berkeley and had a catalog about the reconstruction of large chunks of Rome in the 1930s during the Mussolini era, and it was called The Third Rome. So talking to him about that, then I found these technical books about things that I'd been looking at and doing sketches of that were very helpful, and I thought, that's interesting. And then dinner with Tafuri and getting in arguments with him and realizing that we both had a similar critique of 20th century American architecture, which I found out, I didn't realize this is Marxist, but I guess I am. I hadn't read it, but he and I agreed about what was wrong with some things. But anyway, so I was reading very interesting, different things than I had been reading before, and it was helping me. But then I discovered that this guy Halprin, who had worked for Church, actually was the person who did the choreography for the architecture at Sea Ranch and this whole ensemble. And it turns out that that was a pretty interesting thing, even if the buildings looked just like the buildings I'd been doing at Ed Barnes' office in the East Coast before that. So I thought, that's interesting. The architecture seems to be lagging, but this landscape stuff seems pretty interesting. And then it turns out this landscape architect was interested in cities like I was. That was interesting, and that he'd done a whole book on cities, and that he had done this scheme with the Portland Redevelopment Authority with a whole bunch of architects, but he did this ensemble of public spaces and walkways and fountains, and one of which had already done called the Lovejoy Fountain. Well, rooting around in the Academy Library, I found MIT had already published a sketchbook of his, of things from his trips up into the Sierras, into Yosemite. That's Vernal Falls, and that's one of the things, that and Nevada Falls up above that. I can take you to where he did all these drawings. It's very interesting. So I thought, here's a guy who's looking at nature like I like to look at nature. He's interested in cities like I'm interested in cities. He draws, he keeps sketchbooks. That's interesting. That's a way you could be. And so this is the lower fountain, now called Iris Fountain. It used to be called Auditorium Forecourt Fountain. But one of the things, this is my sketch when I went to see it, because I wanted to do my analytical drawing, trying to figure, okay, what did Larry do? I'm on the spot and I'm looking at the damn thing. You know, so one of the things is that I realized that I agreed with him about something, and that is cameras just don't cut it. You can take a lot of pictures, you can walk away with a lot of photographs, but you don't spend the same time, and you don't learn as much. And that sitting still and drawing, there is no way you will learn more than doing that. And I thought, aha. But meanwhile, there's the things you can learn visually you can't learn verbally, but then there's the things you need to say or learn verbally you can't do visually. And I thought, oh God, this is very interesting that you. So the sketchbooks ended up being something that were notebooks and sketchbooks. They're not diaries really. And most people don't realize how analytical drawings can be. Here's a drawing I did, for instance, you start at the left, it's the Four Rivers Fountain in the Piazza Navona. The first drawing I did. And then the second drawing is this one over to the far right, where I began to boil it down. And then the third drawing is the one up above that, you can see, where I've got it even simpler. And then finally, there's just the torque of the thing. The last drawing up there, I kept looking and kept looking and kept looking, and each drawing had less and less and less in the drawing, and there was more and more. It's like when Lou Kahn picked up a little model in front of a friend of mine and said, smaller model, bigger idea, you know, so one of those problems. So after Rome, I had to do something, and I ended up coming back to Penn, coming to the United States. I had a job. That was a great thing. I had a job I could get paid. And I went to Penn, and within a year, I had ended up moving not only from the undergraduate design and the environment program where I was teaching, where I was hired to teach, I ended up because somebody had a heart attack teaching in the landscape program, and that's how I got to the landscape program at Penn. Narendra had a heart attack, and can you teach 600? Yeah, okay. So sure, I'll teach a student. Penn was a great education for me because here was Ian, and here were the people pioneering a lot of the things that are the most common. Everybody and every student around the world knows how to do these things now and can do it fast, but we were still doing it all by hand. But the notion you could analyze something graphically, overlay it, synthesize it, and then apply values to it, and then make rational decisions seemed so obvious. Why weren't we doing this before? And now, of course, we do that, and we do all sorts of other things in 10 minutes. But so at Penn, I was with, let me back up for a minute. I was with social scientists and natural scientists and designers and planners, and it was a great combination, but I had stopped writing because by accident I'd opened an office. Harry Cobb had asked me to help on a project, and one thing led to another, and we ended up with an office. So Bob and I, you know, we were busy. We're teaching in daytime, working in the office at night and on weekends, and trying to put it all together. And so the English book kind of drifted off to the side for about 10 years there. It just kind of sat over there and irritating me. But when I got up here to Harvard after 8 years at Penn, I was in a new place. I had this other routine, and I could invite people I thought were interesting and might be good for the students. So I brought Jeffrey Jellicoe. People I'd been reading, I thought, listen, let's have Dame Sylvia Crow. Let's bring some people from all over. I brought in a guy who later became the head of the National Park Service, who at that point was just head of a history museum in Washington, D.C. We brought Sam Bass-Warner over, brought all kinds of people here, and I thought, this is very interesting. I can just get bright people to come and be with us, and we'll all talk, and let's bring people who write good stuff. They're really interesting. And then there was this visitor, one of the visitors that I liked and spent time with was Richard Sennett, who had just written a book called The Fall of Public Man. Brilliant guy, a little nutty, but very good, and he's very intense, and he was interested, he had been heavily influenced by Deleuze and by a few of the French post-Marxists like Lefebvre and people like that. So he was an interesting guy to talk to. And then I met Kevin Lynch. Kevin asked me to come teach in his site planning course and give a couple lectures there, and then he and I were picked by the Getty to join the Arts and Architecture Thesaurus project, where we worked on for a couple of years, and we got in a huge fight with the art historians and architecture historians because they were trying to put they're trying to construct this thesaurus with words in a hierarchical way so you could look up stuff. And they were putting landscape architecture under architecture like it was interior design or furniture. And I said, no, this is not right. So we got in a huge fight. It took about 6 to 9 months where I tried to explain that actually if you're doing a hierarchical nested categories, architecture's inside landscape. Because, if you just, and then furniture's inside that. If you're really doing it, because I said, if you look at Vaux-le-Vicomte, Laveau's chateau is like a doorknob on that project, I mean, it's just like you don't have it right. So Kevin and I prevailed, and I think I haven't gone on the web to see if it's still the way we left it, but that was interesting to me. While I was here, I'd been studying Olmsted a lot on my own when I was at Penn, and I was asked to join the Massachusetts Society of Olmsted Parks, which that led me to working with people and ending up on the advisory board for the Olmsted Papers. And there's Cynthia Zajcewski, there's Charlie Beveridge, there's David Schuyler. These are really quite wonderful historians that I felt, well, these people are doing the real original research, they're working over the real materials, and they're bringing the news to us about what the client relationships were, what was on their mind, what was happening. And I thought it was all fabulous. So I tried to help. Well, there were some other things going on here at Harvard at the time. We'd lost some people because of faculty turnover and that sort of thing, and retirements. And there was no natural science in the building. And Al Fine had died, we had no history. So now what do I do? So we had a search. I learned a lot about politics at Harvard, which was, shall I say, unpleasant, but it was a real education. And we've succeeded in bringing in somebody, because I said, I want an ecologist who doesn't study wolves on isolated islands. I want somebody who studies inhabited landscapes. And so we finally found Richard Foreman, who became probably the foremost landscape ecologist for inhabited landscapes on the planet, and has been enormously influential to our field. So we managed to get Richard after a difficult search, and he's been extremely productive and helpful. History was another story. There was problems with the history. There's like two streams. There's the economic, geographic, cultural stream, the everyday culture, the J.B. Jackson guys, the minings, et cetera. And then there's the art history folks who are studying, Bernini and everybody else, and Lenotre. So, and there is not a historian that I know alive at the time who could do both. So we had a search, and we ended up finding somebody who could at least teach one of them really well, who was a J.B. Jackson protege, and that was John Stilgoe. So we hired him, and he turned out to be very productive. But he wouldn't enter the building. He tended to be somewhere else, so that became a problem. So we still didn't have the art history that we needed, even though we'd got landscape history pretty much. So my solution was to ask Betty McDougall, who had just become, when I was in Rome, I met her, she had just become the first librarian for Dunbar and Oaks for the Garden Library. And Betty started the program for the symposia and the publications at Dunbar and Oaks. And so I asked Betty to come up and teach history, the other missing part. And she commuted, and she was difficult, and the students didn't really like her, and she was intimidating, and the travel was terrible. So I thought, oh, what am I going to do? So, and she was wonderful, but wasn't the right fit. So then I found Melanie Simo, who was terrific. She was great. She's gone on to write not hundreds, but many, many good books. Melanie came, but I didn't have a position. I couldn't hire her. So she was here for a while, and she wrote this actually superb history of this school, or our department in this school, shall I say, which I think is actually very perceptive and very fair. But so Melanie was, so I tried to patch that together with people who were productive, writing, doing good things for the field, but it didn't totally solve everything. It still goes on. Anyway, so in the commute back and forth, one of the things, and traveling for jobs, I had a lot of time on planes. I had a lot of time away from home on my own in hotels and in rented rooms. And so I had a lot of time to read and to try to stay ahead of the students, many of whom had a much better education than I did in their undergraduate liberal arts days, and were sharp as whips. And so I decided I've got to give myself some more education. So I discovered Karl Popper and his Open Society and the Enemies, his critique of Plato, his critique of Freud, his critique of Marx. It was brilliant. And I thought, aha, this is really helpful stuff. And then there was Fernand Braudel and the whole Annales group in Paris and in France that included, what's his name, Trischopics, you would know. Yeah, thank you. And other people, and Lefebvre. And so I was reading things that were helping me, and I thought, these actually are things that affect landscape architecture. They should know the history of the economics of the regions and the trade as to why we are doing what we're doing. But the other thing that happened the first year I was here was I was invited to a retreat that the NAA put on about creativity. And what an interesting thing to have a NEA put on a retreat, and it was the design arts folks, and they invited Nelson Goodman, who was teaching across, is a philosopher teaching across the street in Emerson Hall. And he had been writing things that were heavily influential in aesthetics, in art aesthetics through the late 20th century, basically arguing that art has meaning, it has expression, and it has all kinds of purpose, but that it's not verbal, and it doesn't mean in the way other things mean. And he was interested in the notion of different languages, art being, that there's different languages of music and dance, etc. And each one has its own grammar, its own way of finding and expressing meaning. And so we used to meet for lunch, a couple of us here from the GSD, we'd go over to the faculty club and we'd meet Nelson for lunch. And that went on for a year, and I found it very, very helpful. And I really liked his work. Well, out of that, one of the things that happened was I was teaching a course here, trying to figure out what we're doing in this whole problem of theory. And one of the things that Ann Spurn, just as I was leaving here, and she was still here, she hadn't gone to Penn to become the chair there yet. She was my assistant program director here. Ann was asked to guest edit an issue of Landscape Journal, and she asked me to do an article, and I said, yeah, I'd like to do it on form, meaning, and expression. So I wrote this thing that basically summarized what I've been thinking about for the last 2.5, 3 years, and got it out, and as it turns out, it created some controversy. It took a few years for it to really bubble up, but Mark Tribe took exception to it and wrote a thing, Must Gardens Mean? And then Jane Gillette wrote a thing saying that gardens can't mean anything, it's impossible. And then someone else wrote something else. And then John Dixon Hunt came to my defense in the Journal of Garden Design and History. And so one of the things that happened was actually people were arguing, things were happening. I thought, this is great. You know, they're talking about, so because I'd been trying to get people to take this stuff seriously. And they really were. And I didn't mind people arguing with me. Meanwhile, here's our office library. Every office I know has a library. Some of them are small, some of them are big. Ours is actually quite big because I gave it several, 30, 40 boxes of books from my own library at one point. But the thing about most office libraries is that they have all different kinds of books. And it's interesting that the bulk of them tend to be things that are helpful books, that are compendiums of information. Some of them are old standards like the Ecology of North America, which is, seems like a fossil now, but, it's a great resource still, because it's still true, what's in it. There's Durr. Everybody I know knows Durr, and actually, if you don't know Durr, I would recommend you go look up his entry for Katsura. It's one of the greatest entries. You break out laughing, and it's so wonderful. These books are actually really written by brilliant people, and nobody reads them for their content. They don't read them for their style either. But the other kind of book that's in office libraries, aside from technical things, are quite often monographs on particular landscapes or gardens. And these are things that designers would love if they are well done, because they have beautiful pictures. And people look at the pictures very carefully. They don't just look at it and turn the page. They study them. And the best ones have really good measured plans. And they have scales. And you can figure out things like that's Katsura. So this is a whole range of books that you find in most professional libraries that are well loved and quite often well used. Well, I left Harvard exhausted because of the commute, and it was crazy, and so it was great. I loved it, but it was too hard. So I went back. I ended up a couple years later being asked to come back to Penn, so I did. And then I ended up discovering that there's a guy I'd met at Dunbarton Oaks named John Dixon Hunt, who ended up, we had a search, and he became our chair after Anne. And John and I team taught a history theory course, it's called, which is an interesting hybrid. But John, on arrival at Penn, on our faculty, started the Penn series in landscape architecture. There's now like 35 volumes of it. He became the editor and organized. So all these books started coming from scholars around the world that he's pulling on. So the publications in landscape architecture are beginning to really, they're growing. Betty's growing them every year. There's another one from Dunbar Oaks. Now Penn's producing them. These things are happening. The literature in landscape architecture, and then John had the ethics to have his books published, not at Penn, but he gets, like one every couple of years. There's another one. So, and he and I had a debate and an argument that we'll come back to in a minute. So at the same time, around the mid-90s, another landscape historian, Robin Carson, starts something called the Library of American Landscape History. It now has over 30 volumes published by distinguished scholars that, every topic from inequity to, republishing Olmsted to, Ethan Carr's thing about the National Park Service and modernism. The diversity is great. So there's this flood of books is suddenly happening that, I was enormously relieved to see this happening. In fact, it turns out all my friends are writing books. Here's Kenny Helfand does a book about gardens in war. Jim Corner, a student of mine, at Penn with Alex McLean, produces this book and then goes on to write some really cranky but very interesting and useful essays. Sarah Cedar Miller begins to mine Central Park and has produced, this is her first big book on Central Park. So all different people are beginning to publish different kinds of things in the field. It's extremely fecund. Well, happy accidents, funny things happen. I was asked to, if I could, do a book with a friend, John Hunt, to help Benedetto Arrigo save La Foce. And so we did. And I happily went and made measure drawings of it and produced some drawings of that. And we produced a nice book about it. And then 6 years later, by accident, when the president of the University of Pennsylvania was trying to figure out where to have a fundraising party for her donors in Miami, I said, well, how about Vizcaya? And she said, oh, what is that? I said, well, I've never been to it, but it's a very famous place. You should go. We should see it. So we went there, and everybody loved it so much. And Witold Rybczynski and I decided we should do a book. So we did a book about Vizcaya and discovered Diego Suarez, a great landscape designer who was erased by somebody else. And this became interesting to me that it was a book against the grain. It was about a retardere garden by a rich person that was quite interesting and brilliant in a way. People who weren't just copying classicism, they're actually practicing it. They were performing it. And so Suarez, I sort of resuscitated him. Now there's a book, a biography of him. So about that time, we realized that there were these other things starting to appear, which are professional monographs. Offices were starting to self-publish things about themselves, and they were basically photo scrapbooks quite often. And I don't want to pick on Pete, but because SOM started, I guess, and Perkins and Will and all the architecture firms were doing this. So landscape architects started. Big firms that had resources started publishing books about themselves. They were basically catalogs, and we would come into rooms for interviews and find stacks of these books by these other firms that we were competing with, and that was kind of irritating. So the younger firms that didn't have a lot of resources started publishing monographs on just a single park because they could document that and they could afford that. They couldn't afford a whole big book. So Michael started doing these, and they're really nice books about a single project and about process, and they're very thoughtful and very well done. I even ended up writing an introduction to one recently for him for the gardener because I believe in them. And these are nice, handsome books that are different from those office brochures. But you leave one of these behind, it's also pretty impressive, even though the clients who are interviewing you, they won't read anything. They'll turn the pictures and look at the pictures, but that's okay. So my partner's in panic because of this arms races going on with professional books. decided they thought my disdain for doing it, thinking I had not, it was like too commercial for me. What happened was they did this, and we decided that we'll give it some content. So we had these conversations with different people, and that was a way to have some content, especially for people who weren't good at writing. That they could talk and they could think, but they weren't writers. And so this was a way to produce that. Well, 2 years before that, as part of what panicked them, I think it drove them into it, was this book had come out at the ICA in Penn. The Institute of Contemporary Art, Claudia Gould had come from the Wexner Center. She was the first director there, and she asked Peter and I to do an exhibition. So we did an installation, and there was a catalog for the thing that actually is kind of interesting. Everything that's in the catalog, this is the installation. It was a kind of a landscape in the form, almost architecture indoors. It was Peter and I having fun, and disconcerting people and getting them a little dizzy, and it's full of jokes. But it was the catalog. Everything that was in the catalog was not on the wall anywhere. It was kind of like an anti-art catalog. It was the opposite of the exhibition. It was 24 of our projects that we'd done, it documented some of the exploration that Peter and I had been doing. Now, he was very interested in process and in philosophy, especially French deconstructive things like that. And I was very interested in, as you know, in ecology and science and art and collage and other things that came out of Western art history. And so together we would have these great arguments. This is one of my drawings for one of our projects. And we would have these great arguments about things because he would attack me for being figural and still thinking that metaphor mattered. And I would attack him for various things about, trying to shoot classicism even though it was already dead. And so we were having a great time doing these projects. But we got very few of them built. We only a few. But the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe does have something important to say on this topic, by the way. There's a reason to look at it. There are no words here. There are absolutely no inscriptions, no representation. It's totally a landscape of form. And I have the strong belief that it has meaning and purpose, and that people go there and they get something out of it. So does Peter. We may disagree about how we talk about it. He talks about it one way, I talk about it another way, but we're both right. And the notion that there are forms of expression that are not verbal, that are very, very articulate and clear, seemed to me very important. Now, on that subject, it dawns on me also at some point, I start looking around and discovering other artists and architects have done sketchbooks. And it turns out Le Corbusier, when he was a student, this is one of his notebooks when he was a student. His trip to Germany. And details on the right, overall mass form on the left and color. After he graduates, he takes a trip to Italy, Greece, the Levant, Turkey. And these are from his sketchbooks and notebooks. I noticed, yes, he's drawing, but he's also writing. We can't help ourselves do both. I thought that's interesting. Alvar Aalto, when I looked at his sketch, MIT published a very nice little book of his drawings, but with some little essays by him. So there's the drawings, and then there's some little essays. That's interesting. That's him at Delphi, and then this is him in Egypt, looking at form and finding some of his favorite shapes and forms in Egypt. This is, I found, interesting. So there's this business of the sketchbooks that you see on the right, and you see the diversity. I have all sorts of sketchbooks. There is no perfect thing. When students ask me what I should use, I tell them, I don't know, just use whatever you can get your hands on. But then there's this other set of books that I have that people aren't very familiar with, which are what poets used to call day books. And these are things that have, you're just right, you put down things. They're not diaries, and they're not narratives, but when you think of something, you put it down, or you read something that's interesting, you quote it, you put it down. And so I have dozens of these too. And it's a thing that in the 17th and 18th century, the 19th century, very common. 20th century poets, I know several of them who have kept them. Stevens is one. At a certain point, to do something less stressful than other things from practice and teaching, I decided it would be fun to do a little book about the Mayor's Institute that I'd been going to. I was involved in it for, 19 years, I guess. the thing the NEA Design Arts program did. And so I published, our office published this as a little one-off thing. We just published a little book about the Mayor's Institute. It has a couple of essays of mine. It has the people who are there. It has the things they said that I wrote down. It's a very interesting little book about civics and landscape and the urban thing. I went on writing essays, and I wrote essays for Landscape Journal, things for introductions to books. I did a bunch of this stuff. But I got sort of tired of the essays and all that. And at a certain point, I felt I needed to pull things together and actually produce something that was coherent. So I had this idea. I'd talk about public space, and then I'd talk about public seating. And then I became interested in the history of it, which I realized I actually knew about, but I had never articulated. I'd been teaching it, but I hadn't written it. So I did this little book about public seating, and it has some of our projects in it, and it has some interesting topics in it. It's a combination of words and pictures. It has narrative, etc. But it also, is a book. And I thought, that's a nice little book. Feels good in the hand. I like the size and shape. I thought that's important. The tactile sensation of the book matters. Meanwhile, I had been doing these essays for the Foundation for Landscape Studies that was founded by Betsy Barlow Rogers, a whole bunch of us, Robin Carson, Kenny Helfand, myself, John Pinto, a whole bunch of people. We were putting out this little journal twice a year, and they kept asking me to do essays for it. And so I kept, okay, I guess I could do another one. And there was an editor for it who was very tough. And that editor was Alex Truax, and she really wielded an axe. She had worked for the New Yorker for years, taught teaching and writing at Sarah Lawrence. And Alice was really good, and I learned a lot from her. You need good editors. They make you look smarter, but they also teach you things. Well, during that period, Paula Dietz at the Hudson Review was pulling together an issue, a memorial issue, or whatever it says, about the environment, and asked me would I write about Alaska. And I thought, this is in the age of solipsism and everything. This is verging on memoir. Do I dare do this? Well, I'll try. So I wrote about Alaska, and it has something about my childhood in it. And that was in that issue. And then Robin said, okay, why don't we just collect some of your essays and publish them, that they're all over the place and are disappearing in various journals. So we did that. But I wanted to do something more substantive that was about my passion for drawing and for the idea of learning to read drawings. And the drawings contain information about the environment and about life and about perception and about being there. So I pulled together a book with about 50 years of stuff over a 50-year period in France and published it at the same place. And the same editor, the same book designer who had done Be Seated, a guy named Pablo Mandel in Buenos Aires. Pablo and I worked together to produce this book after we'd successfully done Be Seated. And we said, aha, so this book has essays, and it also has a pile of drawings. Well, 6 years later, we were doing the second of what we thought was a 3-book series, and that just came out, I guess, a year ago. And it's, again, 40, 50 years of drawings over time, but the essays have been boiled down to almost introductions. There's very little writing in this book. This book has more pages and more drawings and less writing, because I want people to realize how designers look at the world, what they see, and how much information there is, and have people spend as much time with the pages of drawings as they do with a page of text. I'm sure no one does it. Maybe some students will, but I think if we keep trying, we'll get people, if we produce enough of these and people realize this is not a travelogue, this is not a travel book. This is a book about drawing, and it's about seeing, and it's about the environment, it's about public space, it's about architecture, it's about food, it's about being alive. So I thought that's important. So that's what that book is. So I guess I could say that whether you're in a rare book room or whether you're like this techie here in Silicon Valley on his lunch break with a graphic novel, that there's something about the analog page that still grabs us. There is something important about the way the connection between the human eye, hand, brain, page works that I think is different from the digital connection. I believe that. It's not that I don't think we need the other, that we've got it, we're going to use it too much, but I think it's important. I think one of the things is that too many of our students never set foot in the library. I think they find it difficult to pick up a long, heavy book. I think they need to do it. And if they don't, too bad for them. Because the world will pass them by. Because books were here before we were. And books are going to be here after we're here. And this digital stuff that's in the cloud that goes poof, like, you know, I just was told that my cloud is full and you have to send money to a corporation or you can't have your stuff saved by them anymore. And I thought, well, nuts to them. I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to bother. You know, to heck with that. So I think you have to, and the stuff that I had on floppy disks and the stuff I had on CDs, it's actually corrupted now and it's difficult. Some of the stuff that's 10 and 20 years old, you can't open it anymore because it's gone to hell. Well, we still have papyrus. You know, so it seems to me that books matter. So the brilliant neurologist Oliver Sacks, the guy who wrote Awakenings, the first of 16 of his books on a variety of subjects, mostly they're books about the troubles and the mysteries of the human brain and life. He once wrote a note to himself that said, he said, "Need to write. Why?" And he answered it with, "Understand, put in perspective, describe, share, express myself." Well, I agree. I agree. I think one of the leading motives to write is, the first one is curiosity. The second one is irritation. That, you know, I can't find the book I want. I better write it. You know, that's, believe it or not, that's been my case. I couldn't find what I needed. So go find it yourself, make it up. And then the next thing is, I think, as we return to Emerson and his remark, first we read and then we write, to the students who are here, I'd say, this leads to a further thought. Actually, permission or even an obligation for you to follow your passions, think for yourself, argue with your faculty, and be skeptical, listen carefully. They're often right, but quite often wrong. Or wrong for you, maybe, right for them. And share those thoughts publicly. Dare do that. You know, draw it, write it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I did run over, but oh well. We have a few minutes left. Sorry. All right. Oh, you want? Yeah. Hot seat.
You got a great crowd, Laurie. Thank you for maybe the best testimonial I've heard in years for a life with books and a life of drawing. So I have a few jobs, and one of them is I'm a stringer for the New York Times in the obituary department. And I've done a lot of homework, but I learned something tonight that was very useful. First of all, I know the obituary is not going to be useful for 30 more years because of the amount of energy you bring to a room.
Yeah, I was a little wound up.
Welcome back.
Well, you know, coming back to Harvard is, you know, it puts a load on you, you know. And then there's this clock, which I ran over, by the way. So I think you did too.
That big clock staring. Yeah. I did too.
Yeah,
I did too.
Yeah.
So I guess I knew this, but I relearned it tonight. That period of the late 50s, early 60s, where you're like, okay, you're out in Amagansett in a cabin, you're at Bainbridge Island, you're hiding away, looking at the English landscapes. You're vagabonding.
Yes, I was.
Yeah, no, this is the thing.
I was just one step up from homeless, actually.
Unhoused, nearly unhoused, and roaming. Yeah. But the point I want to make is that vagabonding, like with Jack Kerouac, takes time. It's very analog. It produces good thought. But you have to make the time for vagabonding. And I think that seems today very hard to pull off.
Well, if the economy crashes as it may, I think we'll all have time.
Okay, so remember vagabonding. We've got a lot of. This is very timely because we
Go out and see the world, you know.
you know,
Tenting in America. That's right.
if the Harvard path doesn't work out, maybe vagabonding will. You also cited Form and Meaning from 1987, which was very influential on us as students and young practitioners and let's say aspiring teachers. And one of the things that you said in that essay, which I'll never forget, is students, you cannot learn these projects from the slides in your classroom. You must go and see them. And this is another thing that has changed. Our students now are motivated to go to the Andes, or they want to see the path, the pollinator path, and so on. So I just want to make an observation that we are traveling. Our Penny White is still going strong, and students are getting out there. They're looking at different things, and that's just maybe a mark of your period, of which you have several great followers. Okay, I'm going to step aside because these two are like a one-man band.
Well, thank you. Laurie, thank you for doing something that we often talk about, but you showed it, which is you developed your own intellectual library over time. It's not something that was given to you.
Such as it is, yes.
But so I encourage everyone to think about that, which is as you, as emerging professionals and people interested in this discipline, that ultimately you build your own vocabulary through reading. Now, I want to turn to the drawings.
Let me interrupt only to say that I've told my students often that possibly the most difficult and interesting design problem they'll ever have is themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, the old Wittgenstein line about working on yourself.
I knew somebody had thought of that.
But old Ludwig. But the thing about the drawings, I just want to sort of touch on this. When I was your student and when I worked with you, it was the engagement between us over the page, and how that you have shown it in your work in these images, but as a way of engaging the design process both at the beginning and at the detail level. It's that space that the page and the two of us and others in the office as drawing almost together, or watching someone draw you, and understanding, yes, that is where we're going. That moment is where I think a lot of effort that I'm putting in at the moment needs to be taken. I mean, it's not an easy facility. You started when you were 6.
Well, yeah, plus or minus. Yeah.
But it is an area of the discipline that I think we need to think about more. What do you think?
Well, but Alistair, I would say this, since I've taught drawing off and on for years, in writing there's the grocery list, and then there's the office memo, and then there's a report, and then there's a letter or something, and then there's actually a narrative, a novel, and then there's poetry. There's different levels of writing. And I think in drawing, there are different levels of drawing. And I have told people I can take someone and get them past the laundry list and up to the business letter level of drawing. At least everybody can get that far. All of us can learn to sing, songs when we're in school, but very few of us have what it's going to take to end up on the stage at the Metropolitan Opera. So there is a difference at a certain level. Now, I can take students and usually get them to a pretty good level of representation across the board that is, everybody in the room would think, yeah, it's a pretty good drawing. And it's doing its job. Beyond that, then, it's you love it, you feel it, you have a sense of the medium, and then, there's this mysterious thing called talent. But I would say that people forget that a large portion of our brain is devoted to analyzing visual data. A huge chunk of our brain is for processing visual material. And that, you know, one of the things that's in that film you referred to, I'm quoted in that, is pointing out that, remember that when you look at a human skull, there's these two round holes. Well, what hangs out of those holes is we call our eyes. But the eyes are not a separate organ like your kidneys or your liver or your gallbladder. Your eyes are actually part of the brain that's hanging out, looking around, trying to feed itself with information. You know, that the brain is actually hanging out, looking around, you know. And so when, that's what's going on with your eyes. You know, they're not just something else. And that when you pick up a pencil, the nerves go right into your brain also. And so the hand-brain-eye coordination thing is something that, you know, how people can do a drawing by typing, it just defies me, you know, because they're not usually very pretty drawings. In fact, all those knock your socks off, Technicolor renderings, you know, they're horrible, actually, because everything's in focus all the way to infinity, you know, and everything is too bright and too cheerful, you know. And there's no smudging and there's no suggestion. There's nothing left out that you wish they hadn't shown. And so, you know, like we should get rid of those things. And the clients have stopped trusting them, by the way. That's interesting. They trust my rough drawings more than they trust Photoshop renderings. Because
that's a key point, because I think you've said it. You know, the eye is an extension of the brain, the hand is an extension of the brain in many ways, and that your advocacy of drawing is an area where the tactility of the world can actually be felt. Now, that's almost an internal dialogue, but when I watch you drawing, when I draw, I sense that I'm closer to the material reality than the distancing of other mechanisms. Yeah. Now, the screen is important. The screen is important, but it's where you start that I find interesting in your work.
Do you want to respond? No, I want to take one or two questions. We have really 5 minutes, so one or two questions from the audience, please.
Yeah, we should let you have a chance to have at it. Don't be shy. I'm used to people walking out too. That's fine. You know? And they've got babysitters, they've got dogs to feed, they've got all kinds of things. You know, they're trained to catch. It's okay.
But I am taking notes.
Yeah, so.
Hello.
Are there questions?
Yeah.
Oscar?
At the top. Ooh. Thank you for the lecture. I think a lot of it resonates with me in terms of the physicality of books. I'm all the way in the back, right over here.
Oh, hi.
But what stuck out to me the most is that writing and drawing, you said that you can't help but do both. And I'm curious about the value of words to image. Like we often say that an image is worth 1,000 words. And so I'm curious, like if you were tasked with designing, well, you know, we often deal with the kind of visual culture in terms of, as an architecture student and as with landscape as well. And I'm curious, if you were to design a project, do you think you could design something purely with words and not image?
It's a tough question, but I value words enormously, especially well-composed, well-chosen words, because you know, we have a great tradition of great writing in all of our cultures, East and West. And one of the things I'd say is that I have a problem. When I start writing, I write the way I draw, just too much. And my editors are always saying, you know, you start 3 or 4 beginnings and there's 3 or 4 endings, and, you know, you show too many examples. And so one of the problems, I do believe in writing, but I think writing, as Mark Twain said, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time. The notion of how to write with the same concision that one can draw, I think it's harder for most of us, and I will bravely include most of the people in the room. It's harder for us to be as succinct and clear and as formally on top of the game in our writing as we are in a drawing. People in a school like this. That wouldn't be true if we were over in Emerson Hall, but it's true here, usually. And one of the things I'd say is that we can't do without writing. But one of the things that happened to me when I was a student, and that we did to our students quite often at Penn and occasionally at Harvard, was we would put up our drawings, and then we wouldn't be allowed to say a word. The faculty just look at the drawings and talk about the drawings. And there was no talkitecture. It was all on the board or it wasn't there. If you couldn't draw it, you didn't have an idea. My mother had ideas, but she couldn't draw. She wasn't a designer. Everybody has ideas, but when the students start telling me they have this great idea, I said, well, what does it look like? And if they can't show me what it looks like, they don't have a bloody idea, because it has to have form. And everything has form. That word is a difficult word because, clouds have form, and that sort of thing. But words are very important in how we use them. You can damn things by what you call them. You can, as we just saw in a political election, the power of naming things and the taint they give or the blessing they give. So I think one of the interesting things is that usually when my partners and I are making presentations, we try to have the drawings that people really like the drawings, and we really want them to love the drawings. Then they pay attention, you've got their confidence, and then don't say too much, because they usually don't have that much time. They don't want you to go on and on and on. They want it really simple. Well, the world is usually complicated. You want to tell them more than they have time to hear about. So that's my answer to that. It's longer than you expected, but oh well. Do we have time for one more? Or?
We can take one more question.
They're patient. Yeah. Oscar. This is a man I know I've taught with occasionally. He may be difficult.
No, it's exactly the opposite. I'm not going to ask any question. I just want to say that I think you have two ingredients in your drawings and writings that I feel, and that is, in my opinion, honesty and sense of humor. And that's what you convey, and that's what you have inside in order to be able to come up with those writings and drawings.
That's not a question.
No, it's not a question.
No, but it's a beautiful thought to end
Thank
on,
you,
Oscar. Thank you.
I said it was not a question.
There's one more thing. Laurie, could you show us what kind of pen you use?
Well, yeah. Now this is embarrassing on the one hand because it's expensive. And when I was a student, I didn't have an expensive pen. The only reason I have this is one of the pens. I actually have another pen with me that ran out of ink earlier, so I have this one.
Alistair, could you show us your pen?
I'll confess it's a Mont Blanc, which is too expensive. Don't get one. But the reason There's another one. Yeah. They're really good fountain pens.
Here's to Mont Blanc.
Okay, so okay, since we're there, when I was a student, I had a Esther book. It's something you buy in a dime store. My grandmother had one. The one thing I never draw with is a ballpoint pen because they're terrible. They make these greasy, uniform, horrible lines. But the thing about these pens, like any decent fountain pen, and there's dozens of them, is that the nib is flexible. And when you draw, I did a lot of drawings for many years with architectural drafting pens, rapidographs where you shake them to make it work, and they're like needles in the ink, and they're always clogging up and everything. Those pens, the problem was the line was meant to be uniform, so it was always uniform. The line is the line. It was like the lines the computer makes. If you pick up a real fountain pen, it's like a quill pen, and the thing about it is when you push the two pieces that have a slit between them spread out and you get more ink, and when you let up it gets a finer line, and if you turn it over you get a really fine line. And you can take a fountain pen and make all kinds of lines with it, and you can make a very expressive line. And so that's why we like real fountain pens. The reason I have this one is that years ago I was doing a project in London, and the client seemed very happy with it, and they gave me one of these for a holiday present. I actually like the client that gave us a case of Moët and Chandon, but that was. But I will say that ever since that one, I thought, well, this is really a nice pen, and so I've treated it as an office expense. So because the office pays for computers, it pays for laptops, it pays for all kinds of stuff, I said, it's going to pay for this, damn it. You know, so we always, so when I lose them and break them and wear them out, we just get another one, okay? Did that answer your question? So thank you very much.
Thank you all.